Let's be honest. If you believe Venezuela's president was taken only because of law enforcement, then you haven't been watching how the modern world actually works. Because when a sitting head of state is seized in a military operation and the word oil appears in the same breath as transition, that's not just politics. That's energy strategy. And today we'll walk through it with numbers, not slogans. Here's the clean timeline. In early January 2026, major international outlets reported that Nicolás Maduro was captured by U.S. forces in Venezuela and taken to New York to face criminal charges. The aftermath was immediate uncertainty. Who governs, what happens next, and how the world responds. But here's the critical detail most people missed. The same reporting showed two narratives running in parallel. 1. Law enforcement, indictments, criminal charges. 2. Energy and control, statements about oil interests and even talk of the U.S. running Venezuela temporarily. That contradiction matters, because if this were only an arrest, no one would be discussing running the country. So the real question isn't what happened. It's why now? Why this scale? And why this target? Officially, the justification is familiar. Criminal charges, narcotics, enforcement. But even legal experts quoted in mainstream reporting raised a basic problem. You don't call something law enforcement while simultaneously discussing political control. When a state says, "This is just an arrest," but also says, "We may need to run your country," that's not policing. That's power projection. And in geopolitics, power projection usually follows cash flow, which brings us, inevitably, to oil. Let's put one number on the table. Venezuela holds roughly 303 billion barrels of proven crude oil reserves. That's about 17% of all proven reserves on Earth, the largest reserve base in the world. Now let's do the math carefully, not carelessly. At around $48 to $50 per barrel, that reserve base represents roughly $14.5 to $15.1 trillion in theoretical gross value. And I emphasize the word theoretical, because much of this oil is extra heavy crude, requiring diluents, specialized refineries, massive capital investment, and years of rehabilitation. But even discounted, even slow to extract, this is still one of the largest energy prizes on the planet. That scale matters, because only assets of this magnitude justify this level of geopolitical risk. Most people hear the word oil and imagine a single commodity. It isn't. Venezuela produces heavy and extra heavy crude, primarily from the Orinoco belt. Heavy crude is not just harder to pump. It's a refinery compatibility problem. The U.S. Gulf Coast contains some of the most complex refineries in the world, many of them engineered decades ago specifically for heavy crude slates. This includes CITGO's 3 major refineries, with combined capacity of roughly 807,000 barrels per day, designed to process heavy Venezuelan oil. You cannot re-engineer these facilities overnight. Politics can change overnight. Refineries cannot. So when heavy crude supply tightens, refiners don't pivot. They scramble. That scramble shows up as fuel oil substitution, widening crude differentials, compressed margins, and distorted trade flows. This is not ideology. This is industrial physics. Let's be precise. An arrest normally implies jurisdiction consent or extradition judicial process. What was described here looked very different. A military operation inside a sovereign state, with legal experts openly questioning its status under international law, and reports indicating even legislative bodies were not fully notified in advance. That's not routine. That's force projection. And historically, force projection appears where strategic commodities are at stake, especially when infrastructure is damaged but recoverable. Which brings us to Venezuela's paradox. The largest oil reserves on Earth, paired with collapsed production, aging infrastructure, and a system that could, under new control, attract massive foreign investment. That combination is rare and valuable. Now we move to the shadow layer. Over the past 2 decades, China extended tens of billions of dollars in oil-linked loans to Venezuela, commonly estimated at around $60 billion in total commitments over 2007 to 2020, often structured as loans for oil. The commonly cited historical figure is around $60 billion, with repayment tied directly to oil shipments. Exact outstanding balances vary by accounting method, but the strategic logic is simple. Oil is not just revenue. Oil is geopolitical alignment. If Venezuela's oil future tilts toward one sphere of influence, another sphere loses leverage. So this is not just Washington versus Caracas. It's Washington versus Beijing, played through Venezuelan barrels. Now, another under-discussed reality. Venezuela has roughly $60 billion in defaulted bonds, total external debt estimates between $150 and $170 billion, debt to GDP ratios approaching 180 to 200%. Depending on definitions, debt turns politics into legal warfare. Not tanks, but courts claims seizures control over revenue streams. This is why CITGO, Venezuela's most valuable foreign asset, has been tied up in creditor litigation. So when a transition is forced, the real question becomes, who gets priority access to future oil cash flows? That is not ideology. That is balance sheet power. This is where confusion usually happens, so let's slow it down. Oil wars don't move markets in one way. They move them across 3 time scales. First, hours to days, risk premium. Immediately, nothing disappears, but insurance spikes, port risk premiums rise, sanctions risk increases, markets price friction, not scarcity. That's your first signal. Second, weeks to months, refinery scramble. As Venezuelan exports are disrupted or redirected, refiners scramble for substitutes. Heavy crude cannot be replaced cleanly by light crude. So, heavy-light differentials, widen substitute imports, rise margins, compress or shift. This is where distortions become visible. Third, months to years. Infrastructure reality. Finally, politics hits physics. Recovery depends on diluent supply terminal repairs, pipelines, workforce capital inflows. Even under optimistic assumptions, meaningful recovery takes years, not weeks. This is why oil wars are never quick wins. They are long games. Here is the most honest way to say it. Officially, the justification is criminal charges. Operationally, it resembled a military intervention with contested legality. Strategically, oil is the only factor large enough to explain the scale, the risk, the timing. Because Venezuela sits on 303 billion barrels, because that oil is heavy and refinery critical, and because control over energy flows still shapes global power. Oil may not be the only factor, but it is one of the few factors big enough to matter at this level. Here's the uncomfortable truth. In the modern world, human rights language, anti-narcotics language, democracy language often arrives after strategy has already been chosen, because strategy needs legitimacy. But the barrels don't care about speeches. They care about pipelines, refineries, diluents, sanctions shipping lanes, and who signs the contracts when the dust settles. So watch the next signal carefully. Not what governments say, but where the oil flows next and at what price. Stay curious.